Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited for your participation with us today. We're grateful that you're here on this afternoon. I'm excited for our conversation today about the connections between character and vocation. My name is Aaron Cobb. I'm Senior Scholar of Character for the Educating Character Initiative. I'm excited to welcome you to our final webinar session of the spring semester. I should note, just by way of just a quick announcement, that a number of our team is today traveling and going to be participating in the Virtues and Vocations Conference hosted by our friends at the Institute for Social Concern at the University of Notre Dame. So although they're not here in person, they're with us in spirit, and they send their greetings for our conversation today. Let me start with just a few announcements, and then we'll jump into our conversation. As is our custom, I want to invite you to join the ECI community. In addition to learning about our grant initiatives, this is the space to develop relationships around shared interests and projects and to learn from and with each other. So there should be a link in the chat for you to join our ECI community if you haven't done so yet. Another thing I wanted to announce is earlier today, Wake Forest announced the recipients of our 2025 capacity building proposals. You can find the names of the projects and the PIs on our website. You'll see a link in the chat for that as well. Please also note that all of the recordings for our webinars from this spring and last fall are available on our website. There's lots of really good content there for you to engage with and to learn from previous speakers. So please do check that out on our website. And then finally, one last thing about an upcoming opportunity is on June 5th, we'll have our final book club session of the spring. And we'll be discussing Jonathan Brandt, Edward Brooks, and Michael Lamb's book, Cultivating Virtue in the University, which recently came out in paperback. So thank you so much for your participation today. We hope you'll register for that book club event very soon. Finally, one note about our fall webinar series. We're in the midst of planning and sending out invitations for that webinar series. Our theme for the fall will be character for, with, and in community. And we're excited to hear from individuals and panelists who will invite to participate in that space. The tentative date for our first session, if you want to put this down on your calendars, is August 7th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll hear from Jeff Fritz and Kamara Ellefson of the Kern National Network for Flourishing in Medicine. So please put that on your calendar. Look over the summer at our newsletters for future details about our entire suite of offerings in the fall. Now let's turn to our attention to today's speaker and today's session. We'll begin with a presentation of roughly 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have opportunities for questions and discussion with the speaker and with the people who are here on our call. Let me introduce you to our speaker, Rachael Baker. Rachael is the Director of Professional Development for NetView, the Network for Vocation and Undergraduate Education. NetView, as many of you know, is a nationwide network of over 300 colleges and universities formed to support and enrich vocational exploration among undergraduate students. It's a program of the Council of Independent Colleges, and it's supported by the generosity of the Lilly Endowment and member dues. In her role at NetView, Rachael works with campuses to support efforts to implement vocation-informed programs and practices for faculty, staff, and students. She also leads faculty seminars on incorporating vocation in the classroom and leading other faculty and staff through workshops on vocational exploration. Outside of her work with NetView, she's also an associate professor of chemistry and biochemistry at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her research interests include engaging students with virtue formation and resource development to foster belonging in the classroom. She holds a BS in biochemistry from Calvin University and a PhD in biochemistry and biophysics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Rachael, it's good to welcome you to the conversation. We look forward to learning from you today.
Aaron, thank you so much for having me. I was just going to share some slides real quick. There we go. Did those show up for you? Oh yeah, okay. So thank you so much again for having me. I have been really interested in the ways that work in character and work in vocation intersect with each other and have opportunities to both challenge and support each other as we put them in conversation. My goal today is to talk a little bit about vocation as an introduction for those who may be less familiar with it. I'll talk about connections and relationships I see between vocation and character, and then think about ways conversations about vocation connect to conversations about character and can help to capture students' attention by sparking their imagination about what it means to live well now and in the future. Vocation is an invitation for us and our students to consider, interrogate, and engage the world. It serves as a framework for understanding and responding to the world at all times and in all places. Vocation can be both a capacious and an elastic term, which means its language can come into conversation with the mission, values, and where present, faith traditions of many institutions. When we look across NetView institutions, we see vocation being described with different language in ways that fit and are useful to the time and place of a particular institution. A helpful way to understand vocation is to think about the key elements it encompasses and its boundaries, regardless of the words that might best fit the work with vocation at a particular institution. So first, vocation is individual, but it is not just personal. It should include a summons outside of the self because it is directed towards something that is beyond the self. Vocation is not just about pursuing individual flourishing, but supporting the thriving and flourishing of both individuals and of the communities. Vocation applies to and belongs to all people, and not just one particular type of person or way of life. Vocation is inclusive of diverse perspectives, of the contexts, backgrounds, and situations of individuals, and is about making space for everyone at the table. The scope of vocation stretches beyond our paid work. Although purposeful work, both paid and unpaid, is an important part of vocation. Vocation challenges us to carefully attend to the many aspects of our current and future lives, including the communities we live in, the people we care for, the work we do, our relationships, our faith communities, and our choices for service and social justice. The scope of vocation is really the life that we live. Vocational discernment asks us to account for both characteristics and context, considering both who we are and where we are as we consider what we should do. It recognizes that who we are and what we can do is shaped by the place we find ourselves at any given time. And vocation starts with personal reflection, but does not allow us to stay there. Vocation challenges us to look outwards to other communities and hopefully as well to the common good. It is inherently relational. Our lives are lived in response to others, and our vocational paths can become clearer as we attend to those we meet along the way. Communities help to provide the context within which vocational judgments are made. And vocation is not just a choice, it's a matter of our habits. It requires a process of intellectual and moral formation that prepares individuals to hear the call and listen to voices other than one's own. It requires the cultivation of habits and dispositions that center virtues and that allow individuals to continue the work of vocational discernment. So reflection and character are a key part of vocational discernment. Understanding who you are and what values drive you helps you think about the work you're going to do. It adds a why to your what. Building a better why helps students with future action. When they understand their values, they can articulate a broader future vision for themselves, and their what can expand to be a who they hope to be through the virtues they cultivate, who they hope to listen to through the friendships they embrace, who they hope to serve through the communities they attend to. Students who learn to think how to think vocationally are challenged to consider questions about what will make their particular life, a good life. Questions such as, what sort of person am I? Will I become or do I want to become? What am I hearing from others? Who is calling me? What is happening in the wider world? And what is it telling me? What institutions will get my time and attention? Where am I being drawn? And how do I support the callings of other individuals and other communities? When we do this work with students, we're preparing them not just to make a living, but to make a life. What should be a relief to us and hopefully our students is that vocational development is not about a once and forever decision, but involves an ongoing, lifelong process of discernment. We live vocationally much more than we find our vocation. It's a flexible and resilient way of seeing and hearing that sustains our lives. The power of talking with students about vocation is that we catch their attention by asking them about what they plan to do and what they hope their lives look like. And then we broaden their thinking about what it means to prepare for that, to include the kind of person they want to be and engaging well in their present time and place. This allows us to enter into meaningful and purposeful conversations that can include the exploration of character with our students. I want to draw our attention to the spaces where vocation and character intersect. Character is the cumulative result of our most consistent attitudes, emotions, and reactions. It takes into account both how we're formed by our habits as well as how other people form us. There is some level of agency involved in forming character because it can be shaped by the practices we choose and the habits we develop. And I think that one of our most fundamental vocations is a calling of character, to answer the question of what kind of person we should become. Vocation is not a summons to just any life we want to live, but to a magnanimous way of life. Paul Waddell expresses well how vocation is a call to respond to, embody, and witness goodness in all the exquisite ways it can be done. A called life means becoming a particular kind of person and acquiring specific qualities of character so that we can make progress in our journeys toward happiness, excellence, and flourishing. Educating students for vocation means introducing them to a more substantive and indeed more challenging understanding of happiness and of a good life. It leads us into choices of character, ways of being and acting, and of understanding ourselves and our place in the world that give us meaning, purpose, and direction. We are called to things such as goodness, justice, honesty, faithfulness, courage, love, compassion, and patience. There is in some ways, I think, a circular relationship between the virtues required for vocation and character. You can't live vocationally without talking about character, because a calling assumes the virtues needed to live a calling. In particular, virtues equip us to deal with callings as they may become difficult. Take, for example, patience. Every calling requires patience. You may not have all the patience you need at the beginning, but you will develop more as you continue to work at a challenging calling. Virtues like patience are acquired through practice and repetition. So vocation offers a framework and reflective approach which informs and is informed by the virtues and your character, and thus can help direct character formation. There are, I think, some key differences between character and vocation that are helpful to highlight. A character is more stable than vocation. At some point, your character is fairly or hopefully fairly well formed, which is a good thing. We want to have some depth and resilience to our character, a deep, enduring sense of self where we know who we are and people know us. Having a vocation is stable, but what that commitment does and what we do with it evolves over time. It has a more evolving, dynamic quality because at some point a calling will end and we'll have to respond to the new callings that present themselves. I think second, the process of discernment applies to vocation much more than it does to character. Character should become second nature to us, while calling requires a continued discernment. We don't think about our character as much, but people of good character continue over their lifespan to think about vocation. Things like leisure, reflection, and solitude are central in sustaining our vocations, and our character helps us engage those well. And then finally, character often follows vocation. I don't usually answer a calling just in order to form my character, but character does help me to live out that calling and is shaped by how I live that calling. What I see from these reflections is a way that one brings you to the other. And what I want to particularly highlight is that there are some key shared elements relevant to our consideration of our work with students in the classroom that are central to both. The first is that both vocation and character require imagination on the part of our students. And that imagination of what good looks like, what is meaningful, what is worthwhile, is cultivated through narratives, through encounters with the stories of individuals and communities embodying vocation and character to feed our students' imagination of what is possible and what is desirable. The virtues that make up good character and also support vocational discernment also require practice. And it takes a certain set of skills and habits to make that practice possible. Skills like attention, ability to do reflection, ability to form friendships of virtue. Students often do not come to us with those foundational skills or an understanding of their importance in place. We need to think about how we can build skills in our students in support of both of the development of their habits that support both these projects. And this brings me to one of my key areas of interest, that work in the classroom in support of vocational development and character formation share a need for students to develop skills and cultivate habits that direct them towards the consideration of particular virtues and consequently particular questions about their lives. I'm really excited about this conversation and the work of the ECI network because of the expertise that you carry in the practices, skills, and habits that contribute to character formation and assessment thereof, and what we can learn from the work you're doing as we do complementary work with vocational discernment. So let's think now about how we bring questions of vocation into the classroom and how that goal intersects with character formation. Our classrooms offer an important time and space that we can leverage in unique and powerful ways. Classroom time is a precious gift that can be used for shared work, for attention, and for shared experimentation. We have a responsibility to use this in ways that direct our students toward our high hopes for them and provides a scaffold so they can see how to move forward towards those hopes. The classroom offers a way to create room in the noise that is our students' lives for community, for reflection, and for real learning. It can offer rich and fertile ground to explore questions of vocation and character, and this opportunity challenges us to consider how we steward this precious gift of classroom time well. We have an opportunity in our classes to not just talk about vocation or talk about character, but to help students build skills and, through practice, strengthen their imagination about what deserves their time and attention. Another way I think of it is, what could I get students to do when we are in the classroom together that it would be harder for them to do outside the classroom with distractions that are present? This is not to say we don't expect things from students when they're out in the real world, but that we use the classroom as a launching pad to experiment and practice, and therefore increase their chance of continuing this work, thinking, or practice outside the classroom. The classroom has its own set of rules and interactions established together, whether implicitly or explicitly, by the teachers and the students. When constructed in certain ways, it can become a unique environment for experimentation and imagination. This requires teachers to make pedagogical choices in the classroom that allow for risk and also recognize and embrace a lack of control on the outcomes of experiments into which students are invited. But it is in this space that we can begin to equip students with the skills and habits to live vocationally. Our work as teachers is to help set a vision for students about what they should be considering and help them explore questions of vocation and character. But our hope is not just that they know the questions they should be asking, but that they have or are developing the knowledge, skills, and habits and experiences to encounter those questions well. This means that classroom time becomes not only about encountering ideas of vocation or character alongside that, but about using classroom space to allow students to begin to develop skills and practices so they can learn how to direct themselves towards these type of postures and behaviors that we hope they begin to desire. This is why many of the strategies for engaging vocational discernment in the classroom involve some explicit element of explicit support for developing skills to engage with vocational discernment. These skills can also easily be connected toward virtue and character development, which is a central part of equipping students to do vocational discernment. So there are a variety of options when thinking about vocation in the curriculum. You can consider entire courses in vocation, either as an elective or as part of a core curriculum. But this important work can also happen in any class, regardless of what the other pedagogical goals for the class might be, and can often work in creative ways in support of these other goals. All of us can think creatively and find space for this work with students. So I want to share some recommendations and ideas for ways that vocational discernment can become part of the content and conversation of a course. Essentially, how we bring in elements of a broader discussion of meaning and purpose and do it in ways that do not detract from other course learning goals. So I'm going to share 5 things that we've learned across the network that matter for engagement with these kinds of questions. And we can explore how they intersect with character pieces. So first, an overarching theme is that it's really important to develop clear and consistent narratives of your hopes for students and the purpose and value of the things they are learning and the skills they are developing. We have to make these narratives explicit so students see the connections and return to them over and over throughout the course. One approach to bringing vocational conversations into courses where there's already other material or other goals to cover is to adjust the readings and contents you choose to be about vocation, calling, or purpose, or exemplars thereof, whether you're going to engage that content directly or build skills using that content. For example, if the goal is for students to practice their writing, they could write in response to vocational questions and still meet their writing goals. We also see that it's important to make pedagogical choices that align with your narratives of what matter and encourage and require students to work with and in support of each other in the classroom so that they have a chance to demonstrate skills and virtues that are required to be successful in these community type settings. So we have to think about the pedagogies that we use and how those align with the narratives that we are exploring with our students. It's also very important, and one approach you can use in the classroom is to actually cultivate space for students to practice in support of various skills and virtues and strengthen their understanding of how those choices contribute to their habits and to their character. This would have to, again, be coupled to a clear narrative for why it's important and why it matters. And then finally, another way to engage vocation in the classroom is to create opportunities for encounters with others and conversations with them, either others in the class or in the surrounding community, as is appropriate to your course. And as an important element, to then also create space for students to reflect on what they heard and learned through writing or discussion and how it shapes their own vocational questions. These different approaches, which bring elements of vocation into the classroom, very often can also be in support of character formation and can be seen as complementary ways to engage related topics. So I want to share a brief example of what I do in my biochemistry class with students that serves both their present learning and their thinking about their future work, using vocation to direct their attention to character and why it matters. I'm choosing this one to show how a course that has high content requirements and no obvious connection to conversations about vocation and character can still be fertile ground to practice skills important for vocational discernment. This example is going to draw on most of the approaches that I described together, although I just want to highlight that it's not a requirement that whatever you do in the classroom does all of the things on this slide. There's value in even identifying one of these areas that you could implement and explore with your students. So when I first thought about how to bring vocational discernment into my classroom, I thought about how to help students imagine their future work and the virtues and skills they would need beyond content, and then how I could draw their attention to those things and connect them to what they were learning in the classroom. For my students, the starting narrative to invite them into the project is about complex scientific problems being solved in teams, and the importance of developing skills and experiences for collaborating with others to be able to contribute to addressing those complex problems. Once I introduce that, we explore what we know about what makes this work possible and successful. So we delve into the research. Research and experience teach us that thriving community actually matters for collaborative work. That means we need to learn something about how to build and be part of a community if we want to work collaboratively together. Through reading and discussion together, the students are introduced to practices and virtues that contribute to building and maintaining a thriving community and can support effective collaborative work, which is related to one of their goals of being effective scientists. I tell students that since the things we have described matter for their future work in science, it should also matter to the way they learn science. Our learning environment includes elements that emphasize and require collaboration and allow them to develop the skills they need to be successful both now and in the future. The pedagogies we use reflect the values I've described and match the narrative of what I told students is going to be important. Students are now in a situation where working well with others is essential for their success in the class. And while they're at the beginning of the semester and worried about this, and I have their attention, we talk about how we'll support their success by focusing on and practicing skills and habits that can contribute to their success. I often start my science courses with a discussion of humility, just happens to be a useful one for scientists. I introduce the virtue to them and describe what it looks like, an honest and realistic self-assessment about who we are as individuals, possessing both strengths and weaknesses, and who we are in relation to others. I identify for them a series of practices then that are relevant to the classroom that they can try, that if continued would direct them eventually towards humility. It's not going to make them humble right now, but it points them in the right direction. So they get a list of options for how they could choose practices directed towards humility. Each student is asked to pick a practice and try it out for a period of time in the class. Their job is to stay engaged and to try the skill or practice, and then reflect on how that shaped their learning environment. They don't have to like the practice. They don't have to find it useful. They just have to try it. As a class, we practice together at the same time in support of the current learning, and then we explore the results together. So students are then asked to reflect on how they experience the practice in the classroom and how these same skills and habits might contribute to them being the kinds of professionals they want to be and what they might want to carry forward beyond the classroom. To show you the kind of reflection this prompts, I will share 2 reflections from students. This first one, this assignment was definitely on the more uncomfortable side, but it allowed me to move outside of my bubble, develop new friendships, and learn about myself. Through this assignment, I was able to see the people around me. It sounds crazy that I did not see the people around me, but I'm usually so focused on the professor that the only time I look at my classmates is during discussions or when someone asks a question. Through my educational career, I've developed the bad habit of only thinking about myself when in class. All I usually care about is whether I am learning the material, but I started to see my classmates as people who I can collaborate with and build community with. Another student wrote, in a very honest reflection, being in my 6th semester, I have this false notion that by this time I should have a handle on the material. Obviously, this isn't true. If I knew the material, I wouldn't be taking the class. However, I have developed this large fear that I'm not as smart as my fellow students, not intelligent enough to do science with them, and therefore don't belong. The even greater fear behind this is that if that's true, they'll find out. What I realized as I forced myself to publicly ask questions in front of and to other students is that the reason I'm afraid of sounding less intelligent is because of my desire to be more intelligent than my peers. My fear doesn't come from a place of humility, but actually comes from a place of pride. So these highlight some of the things we see from students, which include learning how to see others in the classroom as people of value, and recognizing their own pride and the way it impeded their ability to learn in collaboration with others. They can make these connections because the practices they are exploring are connected to their learning in the classroom. What has been encouraging to me is that the investment in a different kind of activity and conversation has yielded great benefit not only to students thinking about their vocation, but for their scientific learning as well. So the benefits that I see when I do this kind of work with students is generally increased student engagement in the classroom over the semester. And that's partway because I've given them pathways to engage. We've explicitly named different ways that they can participate and then invited them into that participation. I also see, which is nice for me, efficiencies in introducing and sustaining discussion and participation. When students have explicit rules for how to engage and options in those pathways, they use them, and our discussions can be more effective and more worthwhile because of that. I also noticed increased belonging and inclusion of all students in the classroom, and particularly my favorite part is increased student responsibility for each other's belonging. As they learn to see each other and value each other, they also begin to look out for each other as they come into the classroom and see the classroom as a community where they're learning together. And then finally, I also noticed increased vocational questions and thinking in a class where normally students would just be anxious about the things they're memorizing and the tests that they're trying to do well on. So I think that this often works so well because I make it matter for their immediate learning, which signals that it's worth engaging. But at its heart, what I'm doing is prompting students to do reflection about what habits they might want to carry forward into their future work and lives. I'm not going to prompt lasting change to their habits or character through a semester, but the exercise has given them experience that can strengthen their imagination about what happens if you continue to make particular choices over the long term, and the reflection gives them a chance to consider carefully what they might like to carry forward. There are a couple of key elements that make this approach work in the class. I start with a clear narrative about why this matters to them, that captures their attention, because it is about future work that they're already considering or worrying about. I make sure the central theme matters for their present learning, so it has immediate application and relevance. I'm explicit about the practices and their connection to community, and they have a chance to try things out in a safe environment to better inform the reflections they're asked to do. This serves as one example of the way I see overlap between our vocation and character goals for students, and the ways that we can design our courses to give students meaningful encounters with both. I use broader vocational narratives and questions to draw students into an exploration of character-forming habits. The goal of this work is not to shape our students into a particular type of person or way of thinking, but to cultivate space where they consider questions of character and vocation. This is an important distinction, and I want to note that if you pursue classroom spaces like this, I promise no particular outcome. In fact, doing this work with students is not about controlling what happens in your classroom, but about ceding some control so there's a chance for something good to flourish. In the uncontrollability and unknowability of what might happen, we meet our students as whole people and agree to journey together as we grapple with questions of what makes a life worth living. So I want to end with some lessons we have learned across the network about what seems most important for doing this work with students, both for the kind of project I described, as well as more generally for bringing vocational elements into your work. The first is that engaging meaning and purpose with students requires vulnerability and care, which is what creates the space for meaningful discussion and growth. It must come from a place of authenticity. To do this work well, we must carve out time and space or find communities like this one to encounter this work for ourselves as well. It is essential that we be explicit with our students about what we are doing and why it is particularly important. We assume they understand the project and purpose of education, and either they don't, or it's getting lost in the noise of day-to-day things that are calling to them. These strategies and approaches can be used on many different courses across campus. What each integration requires is developing a clear narrative that helps students understand how this connects to the rest of the course and why it matters. These narratives are one way of being explicit. We need to narrate our hopes, and then narrate them again, and then process that together, try again, reflect again, and probably narrate one more time. It's not bad that we have to repeat. We just need to recognize that there are things that pull attention in all directions, and we must continue to pull back to things that most merit our attention, which is again the gift of what we can do with our classroom space. Next, exposure to the topic is not enough. Students must have time to practice and reflect on their experience with that practice and develop the skills needed to do the work. Our values and hopes for our students must be reflected in the pedagogies that we choose. This is not just about what you teach in the classroom, but how you teach. Vocation and character work may ask you to step out of your teaching comfort zone and be willing to learn something new and try something different, or try some different pedagogical approaches. Skill building in the classroom is an important use of this precious space and time and can be in support of all of our learning goals, not just our vocational and character ones. And that leads to the last important point, which is doing this work in the classroom can be in support of other learning. To increase our impact, we want this work to be integrated with the other things that we're doing with students. And one of the best ways to do that is to introduce this kind of thing in small moments that are repeated throughout the semester. Small interventions can make a big difference and contribute to the overall community and engagement of the course. I hope that serves as encouragement to identify a connection and something that you value and to go ahead and try it with your students. You'll learn something and they probably will too. Realistically, what I'm proposing here takes time and work. I'm not naive enough to think that more work will be an antidote to burnout you might feel from already being overworked, but a renewed investment in the things that matter can act for us as an antidote to demoralization. I appreciate this quote from Jason Bear, where he talks about the way that ideals can be a vehicle for hope, and that if we find ways to contribute to the long-term well-being of our students and the shaping of who they are, and if we allow that to inform the way we teach, then our experiences as teachers can be infused with a sense of meaning and purpose and can buoy us as we grapple with the more stressful and challenging aspects of our own vocations as well. The work I've described here is for our students, but it is for ourselves as well, and can serve as a way out of the day-to-day mire to become a gift that recenters us on the values and hopes we have for our students and the likely reasons we chose to work in higher education with undergraduate students in the first place. I hope as I've been talking that you've seen overlap between how we might approach character formation with our students and the approaches we can use to engage students with vocational discernment. And maybe what you've imagined is ways that vocational thinking and questions can draw our students in compelling ways to questions of character. It's not the only way, but it offers another resource for your pedagogical toolboxes as we figure out together how to approach these big questions with our students.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really wonderful. I want to make sure that I give space for people to ask questions, and I'm gonna just if you have a question right now and you want to type it into the chat box or raise your hand, I'm happy to give you the floor so you can ask your question of Rachel. But please, I'm opening the floor for conversation at this point. maybe I'll give a chance for people to think about this a little bit on their own. I have a quick question that I want to throw your way that's just sort of been one of the things you said early on was that character follows vocation in ways that I thought that was an interesting expression. That is, character is required for the sort of commitment and a long-term discernment process that goes on with living vocationally. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the I can imagine vocational discernment being a process itself that could go very badly or very poorly in all sorts of ways, and what kinds of character traits we might need as communities or as individuals to do that vocational discernment process. So, what are the character traits we need to do that work well in the first place? And then, are there different character traits that are more relevant once we sort of are further along the line in terms of committing to a particular vocational trajectory?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like that. I think as you think about this, some of the early work of vocational discernment is really about listening and understanding and hearing from others. I think it's not really a character trait, but the ability to maintain a good friendship is a really important skill in vocational discernment. Things like a strong sense of justice, uh, ability to listen, attentiveness. Those are sort of early things that you need as you're discerning your vocational journeys. And then I think courage. Courage would be a big one too. I think many vocational calls can be scary, especially at the beginning when we don't know where they're going to end up. And it takes courage to make a choice to live into something authentically. And it requires love as well, love for your community and love for others. And then I think you see, things I mentioned, but as your journey progresses, growth and requirement, things like patience, vocational journeys unfold over a long period of time, and things like patience, continued courage, compassion for those you encounter, the ability to forgive, all of those pieces become really important as we continue those journeys.
That's wonderful. We have several questions that are coming into the chat, and I want to make sure that I read them all as they go. But one of them that I think is just sort of a how do you get started sort of a question. So how many semesters have you been doing this approach? How has it changed over time? And what does that look like in terms of starting that process?
Mm-hmm. So for the pedagogy that I described.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to highlight at the beginning that, if you saw what I was doing, it was really nicely integrated. Like it hit all those different features and does all those things really beautifully. It did not start like that. I started really small, and it was really the first thing for me was in identifying a narrative. So it became how can I catch students' attention and get them interested? I looked out at the scientific landscape and I saw that things like that community was important, and things like humility and hospitality, those kinds of things were going to matter. And it took me a while to figure out how am I going to convince students that they matter. And so I think constructing the narrative was the very first piece. We started there, and then I slowly added different practices over time. I've tried out different ones in different semesters. One thing I did learn is that it's helpful to do more than one practice. You don't want to do, if you're going to do this kind of work, you don't want to do so many that you don't have time to attend to each one, but you want to do more than one because they often complement each other. And sometimes one practice doesn't resonate with a student. And so then you choose, but they'll encounter a different practice that they find useful. So something that I built over time, sort of piece by piece through experimentation is my scientific approach there. And it does vary semester to semester because, as I sort of mentioned, we can't predict outcomes because we're working with real students who have real experiences in lives and are going to react in different ways. And so the practices I choose and the conversations we have often vary semester by semester, depending on who's in the class. And I will make mid-semester adjustments depending on how a class is reacting or what things I see that I think they need to focus on or learn more about.
Wonderful. A couple questions are asking specifically about like what are the specific types of questions you ask your students in the context of like the example that you gave. Can you give some more specificity about the types of questions, and maybe it's like the types of reflection questions you're asking your students in those spaces to get them to reflect deeply upon not only their scientific work, but their vocations, their growing vocations or their discerning vocations, and the character traits they're developing.
So at the beginning of the semester, we frame the project. I give them things to choose, And the reflection questions are actually fairly straightforward. I ask them, tell me about what you tried and how it went for you, with freedom to like or dislike it. And then I'll ask them sort of, did anything surprise you? Or did you notice anything that was interesting and might be relevant to you? And then I ask, do you see any value in continuing this practice for your learning here at Calvin or for your future work as a scientist? That's kind of the three pieces. It's just the what happened, what did you notice, and what might you like to carry forward. And the responses you saw, that's just pieces that comes out of that reflection together.
Do you name, this is a quick follow-up, do you name those practices as practices that scaffold humility in this space, or do you spend time reflecting on what humility is, and here's some practices to do that work as well? Is that part of the narrative framing for the
The narrative framing includes, we do a little bit of discussion about broadly what humility is. And a useful discussion, at least in my science course, is what it looks like to have not enough humility or too much humility, because we can have too much of a virtue or too little of a virtue. So we do a little bit of narrating about that. And then we explore together how those practices that I list might direct you towards humility. But we don't go into really deep discussions of the virtues. And that's partly because that's not what the class is about. I'm just trying to leverage space we have and time we have to get them moving on the thinking.
Interesting. Here's a question from a little earlier in the thread that I wanted to bring up. So this is from Holly, and she says, have your colleagues been inspired or intrigued by your work, or have you faced criticism for spending time or some other criticism on vocational reflection in the space of a course that's very heavy in the sciences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've generally gotten good response, and I'll tell you how it actually started is that, of course, we're a science department, which means standardized final exams. You can't really get around it. We have national standards, so we give students these exams. Each section gives them the same exam. And after I started doing this work with my students started consistently scoring higher on their content-based final exams. And my theory is that's because just I'd provided more structures for them to learn how to engage effectively in the class, which contributed to their overall learning in the class. And so that was what first caught my colleagues' attention, is how are you getting your students to always do better than our students, right? And that led to really productive conversations about these practices. And I have colleagues who now use them as well in their classroom, and we haven't been very systematic about this, but we've had a little bit of conversation together about which virtues and practices might fit at different times and which ones we might want to prioritize, so that when students are in our classes, they're not encountering the same ones over and over and over. So for example, our first year students, we always use humility. That's just our starting point. But with my third year students, I'll move into things like hospitality and gratitude and forgiveness, things that are a little bit more complex and require a little more nuancing.
Do you get any pushback? This is a quick follow-up about the explicitly framing things explicitly in terms of moral virtues in the context of, so I can imagine intellectual virtues like humility, or maybe civic virtues as the sorts of virtues that maybe have more uptake in particular spaces, but moral virtues in some institutions might be more problematic. I'm wondering if you could speak to some of those challenges.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to recognize my context at Calvin University. I'm at a Christian institution. We're very explicitly Christian in our classroom. So as I'm naming these kinds of moral virtues, they're actually making sense to the students in a Christian context. So I have a lot of freedom to do that, and there's a lot of resonance with them in that experience. So it may be that the same thing wouldn't work at other institutions, that you would have to choose other kinds of virtues or other conversations. But I will say, I think that one of the important elements of inviting students into this and not getting a lot of pushback is the amount of choice that I give. So I say, you know, this is the area we're thinking about, and then they have choice in the practices they can explore. They always have the option to choose their own practice. And their reflection can be about what they disagree in. So every once in a while, students reflect on why they think I'm wrong, why that was a waste of their time, or my favorite is why they were already humble and they didn't need more humility. That's always a good good moment of practice. But that choice, I think also, and the permission to do something else or to experience it in a different way helps students relax into it and be willing to experiment with it.
I have a quick follow-up question that I want to thinking about different context for this kind of work. And so is even thinking about my own vocational discernment as I was going through college, having gone to a small Christian liberal arts college where vocation was often part of the just part of the culture there. Thinking about vocation was part of the culture. I'm wondering, in those contexts, it's often thinking about calling the who is summoning you is prioritized in that space. And I'm wondering if there's language about vocation that works in non-faith-based institutions to get at the same sorts of character-related outcomes that you're describing in this space. What kind of language would you suggest for those who are working outside of faith-based contexts to do this kind of work?
Yeah, I think some language that some of our institutions have found useful, because we have some non-faith-based institutions, are listening to the needs of the world, a call to the common good. So things that are still in some ways very community and external based, but don't identify a specific caller. And so those still require the same sort of discernment. What are the needs of the world telling you? What do you think, how do you understand the common good? How can you contribute to that common good? So that seems to work fairly well for many of our institutions.
I want to make sure that I address this question. Anna, in the chat, you asked about providing a little bit more conversation about making space for or scaffolding practices in humility. Anna, has that question been addressed sufficiently, or do you want to add to that question? Don't mean to call Anna out in this space, but
No, that was helpful.
okay,
I went back and looked at your slide, Rachel, about, some of the different practices, and I was sort of curious, like, how does one, were you sort of encouraging students to take up a different practice and then reflect on it and then try something else? But I think the more you've talked about it, it's become more clear to me. So
wonderful. Good.
Yeah, I mean, it does require work on our part. Like it takes a while to think about, definitions and understandings of these practices or character virtues that would be relevant and meaningful in a classroom setting, and then practices we can point them to that address that habit or direct us towards that habit in productive ways. So yeah, I've done some of the work for some virtues and practices, but there are more, and it has taken time to do that work well and make sure we're encountering that well with students.
also appreciated when you mentioned the framing that you provide around it without doing, it's obviously it's not a virtue ethics course, but I thought it was really a good, I like that move of what does it look like if there's too much or too little. So you have the one student who's disagreeing. I'm actually quite humble. Thank you, Dr. Baker. And then another student who's maybe struggling with imposter syndrome. And so that there's like a continuum and you're trying to help them think about what's the effective application of proper humility. So thank you.
I want to follow up on that a little bit too. I'm wondering what you said it's your favorite when a student says, I think I was maybe too humble in this space. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I'm really interested in that.
Oh, I will say something that was a little bit of a joke, because the students will tell me that they're already humble enough. Like, I'm a very humble person is what I get in my reflection. And I think that reflection is lacking some reflective quality. But I will go back to I think with things like humility, it is really important to think about this too much, too little, and what real humility is. So we do need to talk about the difference between a false humility, where you're presenting in a certain way, and true humility, which requires an understanding of yourself. And so some things I've pushed some students to, especially ones that are suffering from imposter syndrome, is we'll talk about, have you noticed in class when I ask a question, you have the answer, but you're afraid to say it because you don't think it's right. And then you hear someone else, they say the answer and clearly it was right. Part of this work is having a authentic understanding of what your strengths are and what you know and where you can contribute. And so actually encourage them to participate more, to look for places where they do know what's going on and they can contribute, and take those moments to contribute. So students who are lacking in humility sometimes are over contributing, but some of them are also under contributing. And we can kind of use this as an opportunity to try to balance out those two extremes.
That's great. I don't mean to call out another person in the thread, but I do want to ask. Brian has this question that I'm really interested by. He says, what about vocations where good character is a liability? And then he adds, only half joking. And so, Brian, do you want to say a little bit more about the half of you that's joking and the half of you that's not joking in this space so that we can address the question?
It might help to know that I'm working in Florida, and so that maybe add anything to that. But there are definitely vocations where certain things that would be considered virtues in many other contexts actually might be considered inhibitory to your success in that particular vocation, at least by some professors and some students. So I'm just wondering if that ever comes up.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think that it does come up, and actually, not that we only have to talk about humility, but it comes up a lot in the sciences with something like humility, because it takes a certain level of confidence and pride to be successful as a scientist. And I think that, this is where broader vocational discernment, broader vocational thinking is really helpful for our students. Because what we're trying to do with that work is to get them to really nuance their understanding of themselves, of the world, of its needs, and the things that they're responding to. And, you're describing situations where maybe certain virtues aren't as beneficial. So there's a single virtue that doesn't make sense in the space. A student who's thinking broadly about vocation and has an understanding of virtues and character can do some evaluation and some nuancing of how do I enter authentically into this space without changing who I am, but with tuning myself to the needs of this space and the actions and postures that this space requires. And then sometimes I think our vocational thinking can lead us to then say, maybe this is not a space I should be. If I can't authentically be who I am and live into the values that are most important to me, maybe I need to be somewhere else right now. So it's about discerning into how to be in a space, but also sometimes discerning out of particular spaces.
We have time for a couple more questions. I want to make sure I give space to people to ask their questions. Looks like one just came in. Hold on. So this is a question from Eric. He says, do you have impressions or perhaps some data that students carry the practice of asking thoughtful questions of themselves and reflecting on those questions in a sustained way beyond the experience of the class? As well, you alluded to an evolution of vocational calls that people may experience over the course of their lives. How do you help students understand that what they perceive as a vocation today may look different a few years down the road?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, you're not going to do that in a single class. So this is sort of a program-wide and college-wide conversation that needs to start at some point and then continue to build. I will point you to, so we do have, NetView was started a number of years ago in response to a large grant program that Lilly put out called the Program for Theological Exploration of Vocation. They funded in the tune of multiple millions of dollars, campuses to do some broad vocational program with their students. And then they followed that up with a careful assessment and evaluation of those students that included looking at those students 5 years out, 4 and 5 years out from the program to see what happens when students encounter vocational questions in college. Do they carry those forward? How does that shape their lives? And what they saw was really promising. Students who had participated in thoughtful vocational exploration did not have easier lives when they left college. They still had hard choices to make, but they demonstrated a significantly increased level of resilience to the changes and the challenges that they faced, and were able to contextualize those challenges and identify spaces where they still saw meaning and purpose. And so I think that's really important because this vocational thinking helps our students who are fixated on often the thing they're going to do right after college, that job they want to get, the one thing that they want to do. They're prepping towards that single thing. We know that their post-life college is going to, or their post-college life is going to be very complicated, that they're going to have to discern multiple callings. They're going to have to understand the kind of questions they ask to discern those callings, and they're going to have to take on multiple different areas of work and responsibility. And so when we push students to this broader vocational thinking, we are helping them not just think about what they do next, but understand the set of questions they need to continue to ask over and over as they leave college. And I think that, you know, as I sort of illustrated, it's okay to catch their attention with the thing they care about. So, you know, vocation, it helps us sort of grab their attention with the things they're worried about. And then we try to pull them back just a little bit and help them say, well, what if I care about this, what if I also think about this? What if I also consider not just what I want to do, but what kind of person I want to be as I do that, and how that's going to inform the work I do.
We have space for, I think, one more question, and Liz has just dropped a question into the chat that I want to conclude our conversation with today, and then give Rachel a chance to say some final words that she wants to add on her own. So this is a question. Authenticity seems like an important concept, one that she imagines NetView has thought a great deal about. So could you say a little bit more about authenticity and how it's connected or disconnected from virtues like wisdom or generosity?
So authenticity makes me think both of authenticity as a virtue for our students to encounter, but also for us in our relationship with students. And so I want to highlight actually that as being really important. One of the things we've noticed in NetView, and we've been doing much more, is spending a lot more time with faculty and staff thinking about their own vocations and how they've lived into them, how they feel that they're continuing to be called into various spaces, because faculty and staff have told us over and over that they can't authentically do this work with students, stand in front of them and lead them through this vocational discernment when they haven't had a chance to explore it and think about it themselves. So we can think about authenticity as a virtue, and I think it's one that it's particularly important that we model to our students. And like I sort of hinted at, that requires us being willing to do that kind of work ourselves and then figure out a way to bring it into the classroom with us in appropriate ways.
Wonderful. This has been a really rich and deep conversation, and I'm so grateful that it's been recorded so that we can have it accessible to folks later on. Thank you, Rachel, so much for the gift of what you've given to us this afternoon. I wonder if you have some final thoughts that you might want to offer for us along the themes of character and vocational discernment as we conclude our conversation today.
Yeah, sure. I think, as we often tell our grantees at NetView, we know that you don't do this work because you had some free time and you were looking to fill it up with something else. I think I recognize that each of you who's here has decided to dedicate precious time to help students wrestle with these really big and important questions. One of my hopes is that we can continue to learn from each other about how to invite students into these spaces and these important questions really well. So I'm excited about that opportunity. I just want to say that being with you and hearing about the questions you're thinking about and the kinds of work that you're trying to do is at the center of what gives me hope in my own work in higher education right now. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been a wonderful afternoon session. There's a bunch of links in the chat for those of you all who want to join the community, learn more about what's happening at ECI. Come join our book club on June 5th for our final book club of the semester. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and look for announcements about the fall webinar series coming soon. Thank you again, everyone.